So this build video you're about to watch, Unique Leader Records have commissioned me to incorporate their mascot into a sword. This is Alwrecker the demon. His horns will probably form the guard of the sword. The very first step will be to do a sketch and then bring it into Photoshop. So this is the pencil drawing. I don't have a scanner, so I normally just take an actual photograph of it and then bring it into Photoshop and clean it up. You can see I've made it symmetrical. You know, I took whichever side I drew that I liked best and just mirrored it. My flourishes have been all these spiky, scallopy things down near the bottom. A cloven hoof tip, and near the back I decided to give the sword a fist pommel, complete with heavy metal spiky wristband. So then once I have it to the level where I want it, I start to do a line drawing over it. You know, I have one where the opacity is turned down real low, and then I just start to draw nice clean lines over all of my pencil work. This makes it easier to print these guys out, and you know, because they're only thin lines instead of, you know, I'll print out life-size copies of these to use as references when I'm actually building the thing. These squiggly lines are because I don't have a big printer. So when I'm printing this section out on the regular printer paper, I'll be able to stitch them together properly. Everything here is shockingly low-tech. One of the advantages of having done a lot of these is I have a lot of partial blanks. This was for doing the Sarah Robles sword, but I ordered it too big. But luckily, the new template will fit on here. So this stuff is called Hardox. It's probably not as fancy as whatever actual sword makers use. Being just a welder, I find it works just fine for these giant ridiculous ones. I like printing out a life-size template. I used to try and work from measurements, you know, just like take a rough measure and then try to scale it out. But with the ones with if they have any kind of weird shape at all, you're just wasting your time. The most important thing when you're plasma cutting is to anchor yourself correctly. Like oftentimes beginners will like float above what they're cutting, and that makes very messy lines. But you need to get your elbows on things, and you need to like rest your hand as close as you can to the work area, you know, without endangering it. And that way you can get a nice smooth cut. The key is anchoring yourself. When you have to move your body, come away from what you're cutting and do a little circle. This will make starting the next line as you re-anchor yourself easier. Once the blank has been all cleaned up, it's ready to go in the vinegar bath. The vinegar strips the top layer of scale off, and you know, that's the layer that's hardest on the abrasives. So I'm going to cut out a pair of these 1/4 inch plates that get mounted to the sword, and then this guy will be a separate 1/8 inch plate which I'll mount over the top, and then lots of cutting and grinding to get the detail. While you can just blast through thin material without drilling a pilot hole, these details are so small that I was worried about doing that, so that's what the little holes are for. Start off the plasma arc properly. Well, that's the hard bit done. That was fairly nerve-wracking. That's good enough to clean up with a file now. I want to get a fireproof way of marking where these teeth are supposed to go, so that when I'm carving and welding and doing little bits of plasma cutting, I don't lose my marks. So now I'm going to use the die grinder to do almost a kind of a scrimshaw type thing, where I carve into these marks to make them look more like, you know, three-dimensional teeth. So when I was plasma cutting, you know, I tried to get it as close as I could, but the plasma cutter is not the most precise tool, so you can see the black outline is extra bits I want to take off. Some of it I'll get with the file, but some of it I can do with the die grinder with this thing on it, modified so it can take smaller heads. Probably not that safe, again, as usual. So this is the flesh, rotted flesh, I guess you'd call it. Bloop. There it is over the mouth. Next step is I'm probably going to weld/die grind a bump for the third eye. These two guys I might leave flat and just polish up the insides, and this guy I'm going to die grind a hollow on the back. The next step is going to be, I want to weld cheekbones and eyebrows in. So this piece of thin stuff I cut out is just to protect all the detail while I weld in the eyebrows and cheekbones. There's lots of like rotted skin and stuff. Might be able to get that with just, you know, eating into the surface, but these two features really need to be bumped out. As you can see, the spatter goes everywhere. There'd be less spatter if I could do one long clean weld, but because this is, you know, thinnish material and I'm doing kind of finicky stuff, I was doing it in little zaps. If I did try to do one big weld, it might melt straight through the material, which, you know, would be a nightmare. As it is, this is going to be a huge amount of cleanup. From the original drawing, go and try and do a couple of gouges and things with the grinder with the sanding disc in it. Combination of the die grinder and the sanding disc to try and mimic the kind of mottled, rotted kind of look this thing has. You can see the ears there. Bloop! Ears. All carved out of it like an 1/8 inch. So, you know, it goes down. Each one of those steps is fairly subtle. But, you know, more than enough to feel with your finger. I have this sneaking suspicion that my plasma cutter is only supposed to go up to 3/8 thickness. You can do 1/2 inch, it's just a little messier. There's no real need to do the horns on the sword out of hardened steel. Regular steel probably would have been okay. It's just like an added bonus, and plus I had this piece lying around. That wasn't too bad, even though it was 1/2 inch. Whew, hot, hot, hot. I could tell that the plasma cutter was struggling. When it's struggling, instead of shooting down, the sparks will tend to shoot back up at the head, which in turn damages the head and then makes cutting more difficult. So that's one of those problems that can get out of control if you let it. Fresh out of the bath. So these horns are welded onto the front of the sword where the face is, but I want them, if you do that, it's not, it doesn't line up with the center line of the sword. It will kind of float on top, you know, it wouldn't be in the same plane. So I've welded these on here, and the idea is to use heat to bring this down to the level of this plate. And this is 5/8, the sword is 3/4 of an inch thick. That will line up the horn with the same plane as the actual blade. So that's the general idea. The horn will now start off on the faceplate and then curl down to be the level of the center line of the actual blade. This is why you work with a hose nearby. You can see I got the initial contours ground. Yeah, you can see better when I move the camera around. And yeah, but you know, so that's the start. Now it needs these like notches ground in like a ram's horn. So these little notches, you know, are like the bumps along the edge of the horn, but they also will help to kind of match the grooves side to side, just so they don't look completely different. Not that anyone would probably notice. If you're working outside on a hot day, you always have to make an executive decision between getting really, really hot and getting covered in tiny flakes of die grinder shrapnel. I always pick the shrapnel. I hate being hot. The way I work, a lot of the work of the disc is done by just the very edge. So I do a lot of cutting and carving, you know. So because of the little notches on these guys being so close together and so numerous, I decided I needed smaller ones to do it properly. So I printed up a thing and I cut smaller discs out of the larger ones. You know, I happened to have a smaller backing pad. But yeah, the smaller the disc, obviously the smaller a curve or a notch you can get to. I find the steel wire brush, it's good for evening things out. It makes, if anything is weird looking, it becomes more obvious. So this is one of those instances where even though I was the person who made these, even after I'm finished making them, they look kind of improbable to me. Like, if I saw them, I would not immediately jump to someone burned out the raw shape and then carved out all the notches. These two plates which sandwich the blade, because of the imprecise nature of plasma cutting, they're slightly different. So I'm going to use this guy, the die grinder set up in the clamp vertically, coming up through a hole in a plate to make the two of them the same. So the nose I ground out a bit. The eyes, I'm just going to polish up the base metal, because in the original art they just look white. You know, they have that you know, the Venom Spider-Man look. And the eye, the third eye, I'm going to weld a bump that'll stick out through the hole. I chiseled this in because any other sort of mark would just disappear with the heat as soon as I tried to weld it. One of the mistakes I see beginners make is they spend ages working on something and then they weld a piece and then they ruin what they previously worked on with spatter and stuff. I can't emphasize how important it is just to find thin pieces and shield off. If you're doing more welding, just shield off the areas you've already done. You'll waste so much time fixing work you've done if you don't do this. So there's a little imperfection in the weld, but I think that that's more or less in the exact spot where I wanted to put the pupil, so that might work out. This is a short little chisel because I actually needed the middle part to make some other thing, so I took it out. I have to actually drill pretty big holes. But if you start off, if you go from the center punch directly to the large drill, that's often disastro. So smallish one first. On the back of the sword, or rather the reverse side, I'm going to stick a plate here to make it look like the back of a skull, which means this lumpy bumpy stuff, which was a function of the edge of the jaw. As they come off. I have a feeling I'm about to Google the shape of the back of a skull. So much as expected, the back of a skull is more complicated than you'd think. Oh, I got a sample of these discs, Rex cut. Let's see, do they like how they do? They're a weird kind of. They're different. As you'd expect, they're kind of odd. It's like halfway between a sanding disc and a grinding disc. So, punching in the plate where the places where the bone plates are fused, you can see it there. It was long, tedious work, but you know, hopefully it's worth it. Someone will appreciate it. Everything I do is kind of back to front. Oh man. The an actual sword blank is very small, so it's handy enough to hold it against a belt sander. So this thing I'm doing where the blank is the heavy part, so I'm holding the sander. It's still kind of crazy because like you know, you're stuck at an angle doing delicate work. Your back does feel it after a while. So the thing I'm trying to show here, it's very hard to see, is that there's the way the steel was made. There's different levels of hardness inside the steel. You know, like it's the same kind of thing as you get with like a pattern of Damascus steel or whatever. You know, there's. I'm going to move the blade very slowly and see. Can you see the different? Oh, there's one coming into focus. There's different like stripes, different levels. These are much less than a millimeter. Oh, it's so hard. You know, it looks like I'm actually moving the blades as slow as possible, but this is a close-up, so it's hard. So I'm going to plasma cut these. This stuff is too hard to drill. It's actually bad with my plasma cutter at least to gouge. That's when you don't start from an edge, when you just start from the blank metal. But I have no choice. Like this hole is 1/2 inch, but it actually has to be 3/4. You'd never, even if I had the 3/4 drill bit, you'd never punch through this stuff with it. So this guy is a little gadget I've made for drawing curved edges. You know, like when you have to mark where to grind the edge line, where to carve to. So this is 2 screws through a plate, and these holes mark the various depths you might want. You know, this is the one I normally use, 1/2 inch for the 1/4 inch plate. once this half of the edge is pretty close, I put it in a device like this and go along with a slide rule and make sure that the edge is actually running along the middle. You know, it's 1/4 inch thick, this is set to 1/8. If it's not, then you make adjustments using the little grinder. So that's one 1/4 of the sharpening done. I'm probably going to leave this rough level until I've finished doing all the welding and grinding, and then move on to the sandpaper. The reason to do this first is because once I start welding parts on here, this grinder dust will build up. It's just easier to sharpen it while it's a flat piece. So it's very, very important to wear your gloves, I guess. I mean, it's hot today, so I'm probably not going to even after this. But the grinder, I was doing the stroke and then wanted to switch to the other grinder, so I put the red one down on the stand. While the blade is still spinning, like after you release the trigger, there's still enough force that it makes the grinder move around, so it was starting to fall off. So I put my hand down to try and stop it falling off, because as a general rule I don't like them, you know, the fan sucks stuff in, so having it down on the ground while the thing is still spinning is not great. And yeah, the blade hit me. It's not a very bad or severe gouge. It could have been a lot worse, but it wouldn't be there at all if I'd been wearing my gloves. So I'm going to weld in there and then grind back, and I won't have to worry that I'm taking too much of the weld away. So on the drawing, the ears tuck behind the horns. So to do that, I'm going to grind these bits out, just bevel, so that when I go to fold the ears back a bit, shlunk, there won't be a sharp kink where it meets the edge of the plate. Because I always shield off my finished work when I'm welding, I always get paranoid that I've positioned things incorrectly. That's the weld there. So I wanted this plate to have a bevel going around the edge. It's important to remember to do that before you join it to the sword, because it's very easy to grind now, but if this was mounted flat and the blade was, you know, here, that would be, you could do it, but it'd be a total pain in the ass. So now that we got all those made, finally, I'm ready to get these three guys done. It's going to involve twisting a massive tap, 3/4 inch tap, through those holes, and then putting threaded bar through, and that will lock the plates into place and give it this kind of big, like there's massive rivets holding it kind of look. Tap has teeth facing in both directions. The way it cuts threads into a hole is you turn it a little bit and then turn it the opposite direction, and the teeth facing the opposite way snip off what you've just, you know, like you trim a little bit of the thread and then you trim off that shaving and then trim another little bit and then trim off that shaving. Normally when you're tapping a hole, the main concern is breaking the tap, because they're made out of very hard, super brittle stuff. But with a tap so big, my main concern was A, starting the thread, which I only just barely managed, and B, all the physical, like, you know, it takes a lot of physical force, especially since this is an older tap, to get it to cut. It's always a great feeling when a tap finally gets through and starts to turn freely. So now that these are tapped, the next part is to take little threaded pieces, and I'm going to braze the tops and bottoms and then screw them in from behind, probably underneath, snap off these guys, and then re-braze over the spot where that was. I'll probably have to grind away a little bit of the weld as well if it doesn't break off. It won't break off completely cleanly, I will have to grind it. And then you'll have these studs that look like big giant brass rivets. Yeah! So this is my free labour experiment. Introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Malin from Boston.
That'll do. So this one, I'll carve. I'm going to take a string, run the string down it in a spiral, then take a Sharpie, copy the strings spiral, and then start to carve it in. This will be, in case it's not obvious already, the handle of the sword. Where I was trying to get into these edges, the edge of the sanding disc, it's you know, it's sandpaper. It's particles bonded to a board with resin or glue or something, but that edge burns and leaves a black gunky stuff. Right, you know, like you're not really supposed to use them edge on like I do. The wire brush takes it off. The good thing about having a drawing beforehand and a life-size template and working closely with a drawing is it forces you to stay honest. You know, when you're making things, everything burns you and cuts and hurts. So if you don't have a clear drawing, and there's always a temptation to, you know, just if there's a hard way to do something and an easy way to do it the easy way. Like on this drawing that I did, I have the handle flare out at the end before it connects to the skull. Would anyone really care if it didn't flare out? Probably not. But you know, it's on the drawing. It's just good discipline. So these two chunks are actually offcuts from doing the pommel of Sarah Robles' sword. So I'm going to weld those in, and then I can cut back to the actual bevel I need. Checking it against the template. Go on. Let's hope it doesn't melt through the bottom of the bucket, or that it cools down enough before melting through the bottom of the bucket.
My hand's very hot.
No, don't get the welding glove wet. So what Malin was doing there, as his very first welding thing ever, was he was adding, we found a lump that was almost big enough to make the fist pommel, but we just needed to weld a little bit extra onto it because it had shorn off corners. Tried marking these guys with the coal chisel, so I'd, you know, as this part gets super hot, it wouldn't lose the mark. But because this is an old sledgehammer head, the coal chisel was getting blunt, like it was the head of the coal chisel was getting squashed on the sledgehammer head. We have fist pommel, we have a handle, and then in between the two we have this collar thing. And the collar thing is going to be a spiked collar, a la what many metalheads wear. And to do that, we've made these little spikes in the drill, and then we're going to put them in from the back, and then weld them in from the back, grind it all away, cut it down to actual collar size, and then use that as the thing.
Can I also use the yellow one just so I don't accidentally screw?
Yeah, sure, why not?
Okay.
Use a small piece of tape. It'll only take a second to do the weld. I just need it to hold still for a second. A couple of little bits of spatter in this crack that I want to get out. I'll have to get a needle file. Because the horns come over the tip of the ears, I had to fold the ears back. Oil doesn't form in meniscus the same way water does. Instead it spreads out super thin. Like up to 1 molecule, you know, thick. That's why a soap bubble or a puddle of oil does that crazy rainbow thing on its surface. I don't know how, but some oil has spread all the way out to this edge, even though I wasn't, it's between the plates, you know, sandwiched between the plates. It's messing my weld up. I'm trying to burn it out. Chrome dome, weld it all around. These little bits were hard to get, where the ears beat. See, that one is still messy. If I wasn't able to grind it with the same. This is fairly rough, you know, it's going to be better, but I'm going to have to file this down to make this invisible. This is called a plug weld, where you weld into a hole and then grind back afterwards to join a plate on flat. I'm going to flip it over and tack it on the other side, and that way I ensure that it won't you know, that it's not going to pull in ways I don't want it to. So people like to cast dispersions on, you know, like holding a handle on with a weld. But the trick to doing a proper weld, doing this like so it won't break, is there's a deep bevel cut, you know, and so even though this is ground flat, there's actually quite a lot of weld left there. Like that, you know, like this thing was out to here with the bevel, so there's at least a 1/4 inch here and on the other side that's just made out of weld. The blade is 1/4 inch thick and is suspended a 1/2 inch off of the surface of the plate. The horns are 1/2 inch thick, so I'm suspending it 3/8 of an inch off the plate. See, with the template you run into the problem of the trying to figure out the relationship between a flat object and a three-dimensional shape. Parallax can confuse you. I'm going to have to make a guard for all of this business. So I had to snap this guy off because it joined along the edge, but that was its job. You can see how close the weld came to the eye. And I'm going to weld this guy on the back too, but now that's locked into position. The amount of force you'd have to apply to get it to move would be frightful. El Disastro! While the guard kept 90% of the detail safe, one part blasted through and dripped onto the eye. So that's going to take a lot of careful die grinding to get rid of. So now that the horns are attached, the last piece of detail work to do is on the art. It looks like there's like a frowny, creasy stuff going on here. But what I could carve it into the skull plate, I'm worried that they start to look too deep. So I'm going to add some weld material in here and then carve those frown creases in. You ready?
Yeah.
Go! For the last fine polishing, I used these guys. So this is the sword after the destruction. You can see it's filthy black, but other than that it hasn't got much damage. The you know, I can't see anything major. This is all grease from destroying all of the stuff. You know, because I do the filming at night, I was tired after filming, so I just sprayed everything with WD-40 and put it away. And now it's time to clean it up. If you're ever attaching flaming rags to your own swords for purposes. I would recommend if it's a short-term thing, you don't care about like the rag staying on there too long, it's only to light something else, to use the painter's tape. I used to use duct tape a lot because it was lying around, but duct tape is a plastic and melts, so when it burns onto the sword, whereas this black stuff I'm taking off is like oily residue left by the burning gas. But the duct tape used to just be a nightmare. It would like melt onto the surface, and then you had to use acetone and brute force to get it off, and it would often take ages, you know, far longer than the actual burnt gasoline disaster itself. You'd be ages dicking around with the duct tape. Sometimes I'd even use a heat gun and a scraper if it was real bad. Don't put duct tape on your swords, especially if you're going to set them on fire. I have a pretty big cut on my hand, so when you have a cut on your hand you should be careful not to get acetone into it. Burns like hell. God, it hurts so much. But you know, in a good way. There it is, all cleaned up. Ready to be crated and shipped.
Oh, look at him. He's like grinding away.